First of all, thank you everybody for joining us. This is the Baltimore Babe Ruth chapter of SABR. My name's Bob Brown. I am the newly appointed communications director for the chapter. Uh, Peter Coolball, who is the president of the chapter, isn't able to attend, or if he is able to attend, it'll be late. He asked me if I would cover. This is my first experience with the SABR specific Zoom, so there's a couple of buttons on here that aren't familiar to me, but I'm sure I'll be able to figure it out. But if I pause, you'll know that that's what the problem is. But Tom has agreed to present to us on the Caribbean series, which is a quite timely a presentation, given the fact that that's, I believe, going on right now. Is it not, Tom?
That's right. Dominican Republic is ahead of Venezuela, I think 2-0, and one of the semifinal games preceding
Right.
the
I've
Mexico-Puerto Rico game. Yes.
Yep, I've watched a few innings here and there as I've channel hopped. I always stop at the MLB network, and so if you want to catch this in real time after this session, jump on the MLB network and you'll actually see it. Tom was born at the GW University Hospital in Washington, D.C., so he's fairly local to this area. He was 2 when his family moved to Puerto Rico from the port of Baltimore in 1956. In Puerto Rico, he saw the Orioles' Don Baylor, Paul Blair, Wally Bunker, Terry Crowley, Jerry Devanin, Larry Haney, Jim Harden, Elrod Hendricks, Davey Johnson, Dave Leonard, Dennis Martinez, Dave May, Jim Palmer, Merv Rettenmund, Al Severinsen, John Shelby, Tim Stoddard all play for the Santos Crabbers. They go by the Congrejeros, right?
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Earl Weaver, Frank Robinson, and Ray Miller managed Santos during Tom's time in PR. He attended the February 1st through the 9th Caribbean Series in 2024, excuse me, in Miami. Your research helped Buster Clarkson and Bob Thurman's 2020 induction into the Caribbean Series Hall of Fame. He authored the Puerto Rico's Winter League, the Santos Crabbers, the Caribbean Series, Latin America's annual baseball tournament, 1949 to 2024 by McFarland. Tom is active in the Arkansas Brooks Robinson George Kell SABR chapter and SABR's Baseball Records and Latino Research Committees. Dick Hall's Baltimore Legacy in the 2020 National Pastime is one of his Baseball Research Journal National Pastime articles. I believe that was in conjunction with the conference in Baltimore, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct.
A charter member of SABR's Cool Papa Bell chapter in Mississippi. He was the Mississippi's 1994 to 2022 tourism data analyst. His office at Keystone College, where he was an assistant professor from 88 to 93, was adjacent to Factoryville, Pennsylvania, Chrissy Mathewson's hometown. He conducted a 1993 7-county tourism study for the University of Scranton Small Business Development Center, and his BBA is from the University of Georgia, master's from Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. Tom, his wife Donna, and his Yorkie Paula are full-time RVers in Alabama, Arkansas, Mississippi, and Oklahoma. So we'd like to welcome Tom and appreciate the presentations he's put together, and I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah. Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to speak to a nice group from Baltimore, Maryland, a beautiful city. So part 1 will pretty much cover the Caribbean series from 1949 to 1960, 70 to 80, and 82 to 94. And there also, by the way, was an Inter-American series, the IAS, that took place from 1961 to 65, primarily due to the fact that after Fidel Castro took over as leader in the country of Cuba, he pretty much abolished pro baseball in Cuba in early 61, and there was a hiatus throughout the 60s of the Caribbean series, which I'll talk about in more detail a little bit later. So we'll go to number 2, the next slide.
Oops.
And yeah, next. There you go. Because you all are part of a very distinguished chapter, I thought I would have a quick early slide showing that Babe Ruth indeed did played a little bit in the Caribbean. He went 10 for 29 with a couple of home runs against the Almendares team and several other all-star teams from Cuba. Of course, his counterpart, very fine eventual Hall of Famer, was Cristobal Torriente, who was a tremendous outfielder and slugger who hit 3 homers in a game. Next. Okay, so phase 1 is considered 1949 to 60 during those 12 Caribbean series, which is a round robin tournament. Cuba won 7 of them, Puerto Rico won 4, and Panama won 1 in 1950. Basically, what they did and still do to some degree, they back then they had a home and away sequence where Puerto Rico hosted one game against Cuba and vice versa. Now, if there was a tie, as the case in 1950, Panama defeated Puerto Rico in a 1950 tiebreaker. As I said earlier, from 61 to 65, there were 5 different Inter-American series, and 5 different countries won them. Of course, Venezuela won the first one with a pitcher named Bob Gibson. And Gibson, by the way, returned to Puerto Rico and helped Santurce win the 62 Caribbean Series with the help of a rookie catcher, first baseman named Elrod Hendricks. Panama hosted the 63 IAS and won it. Nicaragua upset a favored San Juan team that featured Clemente batting third and Orlando Cepeda batting fourth. A lot of people still can't believe that happened, but it did. And a team from the Dominican Republic took the tournament in 65 against a Caracas team that featured a young second baseman named Pete Rose. We can go to the next one. Monty Irvin was probably the biggest superstar in the initial 1949 event. About 3 weeks before the 1949 Caribbean Series in Havana, the New York Giants, thanks to a scout named Alex Pompez, signed Irvin for the New York Baseball Giants. And Irvin, in that initial Caribbean Series, went 7 for 18 with 2 homers, 11 RBIs. Those of you who like Westerns might remember the actor named Chuck Connors, Rifleman. Connors was a first baseman with the Brooklyn Dodgers at the time, later traded to the Chicago Cubs, and Connors was a good sidekick to Monty Irvin, and Connors stole 4 bases, went 9 for 22. Next one, please. Next slide. Yes. Well, these are the Scorpions, the famous Scorpions from Almendares. Almendares was one of the 4 professional ball clubs in the Cuban Winter League with a storied history. Their first manager, a guy named Fermin Guerra, he was actually in the States, he was known as Mike Guerra, and he caught for Connie Mack from about 1947 to 1950. He also caught for the Washington Senators and very briefly for the Boston Red Sox. So he was the player manager. Next. In the 1951 Caribbean Series, there was a ball player named Louis Olmo, who was better known as the first Puerto Rican ball player to ever homer in a World Series. In 1949, October 7th, he had a long home run off a lefty named Joe Page. Of course, the Yankees won the first of 5 straight World Series, but Olmo flew to Puerto Rico to a hero's welcome, and Olmo told me in our interview many years ago that was really the highlight of his professional baseball career. He also became a pretty good friend of Joe DiMaggio. When Joe DiMaggio would go to Puerto Rico to play golf, he would usually call Olmo and they would play golf together. Next one, please. So one of my first Baltimore connections to y'all was Hoyt Wilhelm, the great knuckleball pitcher who obviously pitched for the New York Baseball Giants prior to joining the Orioles later in the 50s. But Wilhelm definitely benefited from 2 seasons with Cuba. He pitched for the Havana Lions, also known as the Reds, and Wilhelm actually went 1-1 in that 1951 series against players like Olmo. And however, the New York Giants told Wilhelm that he could not pitch in the 52 series because they wanted him to get ready for spring training. Next one, please. Of course, I'm going to take a deeper look in what Bob correctly pointed out was the Santurce Cangrejeros, which is basically the Spanish version, a franchise that dates back to 1939, 1940, a very important franchise that has actually had 21 different players and managers are in Cooperstown that at one time played or managed Santurce, which I believe is a very significant number. Next one, please. So in the 1952-53 season, the famous Jackie Robinson made one of, he had come to Puerto Rico several times earlier in the 50s, and Robinson went to Puerto Rico with his wife Rachel to vacation, but he also wanted to meet Junior Gilliam, who actually, Junior Gilliam had played, I believe, in the Negro Leagues with the Baltimore Elite Giants earlier on. So Junior Gilliam got a chance to meet one of his heroes, Jackie Robinson. And of course, Ruben Gomez, one of my heroes, number 22, next to Jackie Robinson here. Ruben pitched a playoff game against San Juan that Jackie Robinson witnessed. And of course, this Santurce team would eventually win their second Caribbean Series title, hosted by Havana, Cuba, in February of 1953. Next one. Willard Brown briefly played for the old St. Louis Browns, but he was primarily a star with the Kansas City Monarchs and eventually made it to Cooperstown posthumously in 2006. Willard Brown was, his nickname in Puerto Rico was that man, ese hombre. And Willard Brown, in one season in Puerto Rico, a 60-game season, hit 27 homers, which is still the record for the Puerto Rico Winter League, and it's really one of the top home run totals in all Caribbean winter ball history. So Willard Brown did become the MVP of the 53 series in Havana for Santurce, 6-0. That Santurce team had a 367 team batting average and a 575 slugging. Jim Gilliam played in his second Caribbean series that year and, of course, hit 545. And of course, Gilliam, I believe Gilliam's last major league game took place against the talented Baltimore Orioles in the 1966 Fall Classic. I believe Junior retired after that series and became a full-time coach for the Dodgers until his untimely passing in the late 1970s. Next one, please. This is the old scoreboard, the famous scoreboard at Sixto Escobar Stadium in San Juan, Puerto Rico, a stadium that was built in the early 1930s called Escambron Stadium. It eventually became known as Escobar, named after a bantamweight world champion from Puerto Rico named Sixto Escobar, who had several fights where the referee was the great Jack Dempsey. Escobar has also hosted track and field events. And by the way, I played 8-man football in Puerto Rico. And when I was in the 9th grade in the fall of 1969, we played our home football games at Escobar Stadium, which was pretty old by that time. Next one, please. Don Zimmer was very well liked in Puerto Rico. He joined the Santurce Ball Club in late December of 1954. The Mayagüez team, which is currently playing in Mexico in the 2025 Caribbean Series, Mayagüez released Don Zimmer around Christmas time of 1954, and Zimmer took a taxi all the way to the airport in San Juan, a good 3.5 hour trip then. But luckily, the Santurce management and the ownership found out that he was at the airport, and they drove very quickly to the airport and caught Don Zimmer before he took a flight back to the States, and they basically signed him on waivers, because basically the purpose of the Puerto Rico Winter League and Cuba, etc., was not to develop players, it was to win, and Santurce felt that Zimmer could help them win the title and the Caribbean Series. Next one, please. This was Santurce's 1954-55 Murderers Row. Left to right, you have the great Willie Mays coming off an MVP season with the 54 Giants, a 20-year-old Clemente who would be drafted by Pittsburgh that winter, Buster Clarkson, who I helped get inducted in the Caribbean Series Hall of Fame along with Bob Thurman, and George Crowe, who was quite a good left-handed hitter who later played, I think, with the Cardinals. And this was a great lineup. Thurman knocked in 60 runs that year, and Clarkson had 61. And by the way, Thurman, in 12 Puerto Rico Winter League seasons, Thurman hit 120 homers, which is the all-time Puerto Rico Winter League standard, one more than Jose Cruz's 119. Next one, please. This is the great curveball pitcher who pitched a number of games against Baltimore while he pitched for the Twins in the early 60s and the Washington Senators in the 50s. One of the funniest stories from my Caribbean Series book that was published, last week literally, was that Camilo Pascual, at the age of 19, was traded from one Cuban Winter League team, Marianao, traded him to Cienfuegos, In return, Mariano got 12 baseball bats. So Pascual, in one of the strangest winter league trades of all time, was traded for 12 baseball bats. Next one, please. Baltimore, of course, is a great city, as I mentioned earlier. And as Bob pointed out, my family, my dad took a job in Puerto Rico in the fall of 1956. So we, I guess, the cargo ship included my three older siblings, my parents, a 1953 Chevy, and I heard later that the cargo ship included a bunch of wood because we're talking about a pretty hectic hurricane season in Puerto Rico. So my mom told me that this trip took 4 days and 3 nights. Next one, please. Brooks Robinson, by the way, had a pretty decent season as a 20-year-old playing for the same team that Camilo Pascual and Pedro Ramos played for. Unfortunately for Brooks, his team finished in last place, so he did not get the opportunity to play in the Caribbean Series in February of '58 in San Juan, Puerto Rico. Brooks did tie his 9 home runs in a 75 game season, tied 3 other guys for the home run title. And I believe that Brooks later talked about how Cuba was beneficial. However, he played a lot of games at second base for some reason. And I believe the third baseman for Baltimore in '57 was a guy named George Kell. So maybe it could be that the Orioles management was, checking Brooks out at second base just in case. And I think Billy Gardner also played second base for Baltimore in '57. But I found out when Brooks went to Cuba, Camilo Pascual and Pedro Ramos helped him, get to Miami, Florida, where they took the ferry across to Havana. So I think Brooks developed some kind of a friendship with some of those Washington senators and enjoyed Cuba very much. Next one, please. Tommy Lasorda became very fluent in Spanish. Lasorda, throughout the '50s, pitched in Puerto Rico and Cuba, and Tommy, I've interviewed Tommy one time in March of '93 when he was a manager with the Dodgers, and he told me how much he enjoyed winter ball. And when he pitched for Caguas in Puerto Rico, he pitched in his first World Caribbean Series. The Almendares team, by the way, in '59, won it in Caracas, Venezuela. They had a lefty named Mike Cuellar, so Cuellar was on that team, and Camilo Pascual reinforced that team. And Lasorda talks about a situation where the Castro had recently taken over and talks about all the gunshots that would happen at the stadiums and very colorful winter ball back in January '59 prior to the Caribbean Series. Next one, please. Okay, so this is just a very quick list of some of the former Orioles that had the opportunity throughout the '50s, '60s, and even the 1970s to play in either the Inter-American or the Caribbean Series. So I won't mention all of them. You can hopefully see them listed on your slide here, but it's really a who's list. And by the way, Don Baylor, in addition to reinforcing Ponce, Baylor also played for Frank Robinson in the '71 and '73 Caribbean Series. I mentioned earlier that Elrod Hendricks was one of the few Orioles that actually played in both the Inter-American Series and in the Caribbean Series. Same thing for Mike Cuellar. Cuellar later pitched in several Caribbean Series, and believe it or not, Cuellar pitched in Nicaragua for the Boer Indians. Mike Cuellar was really a baseball nomad. And by the way, my friend Ruben Gomez, who was really the screwball pitcher from Puerto Rico, Ruben Gomez and Luis Arroyo, who was a relief pitcher for the Yankees in the early '60s, were very instrumental in Mike Cuellar developing a screwball by the mid-1960s. Next one, please. Okay, so on your left, you'll see an older guy with glasses named Vern Benson. Vern Benson was Johnny King's third base coach with the Cardinals from later in the '61 season through the '64 pennant season. The heavier guy on his right is Craig Anderson, who wrote the foreword for this book I did on the Caribbean Series. Craig Anderson, by the way, went from the best Caribbean team, the Santurce Crabbers, in '61, '62, and he was drafted by the New York Mets, where he went 3-17 in 1962 and had a rough 1963 season under Casey Stengel. But Craig Anderson lives in the Villages in Florida, and I keep in touch with him fairly regularly, and he's a friend of mine. Next one, please. Okay, the great slugger Reggie Jackson, who I think played for the '76 Orioles. Reggie, of course, mainly with the Yankees, A's, Angels. Reggie actually, when he was down in Puerto Rico playing for the great Frank Robinson, his first couple of weeks, Reggie Jackson struck out like 15 times in 11 games, and he was finally fitted for glasses because an eye doctor in Puerto Rico realized that Reggie Jackson was suffering from astigmatism, and he also sent him briefly to a specialist, I think, in the States. When Reggie flew back to Puerto Rico after a couple of days in the States getting some special eye treatment, Reggie all of a sudden started hitting home runs. And by the way, as a 16-year-old high school kid in Puerto Rico, I saw Reggie Jackson hit a home run for the La Guaira team from Venezuela in the February '71 World Series. So I take a certain amount of, I think, of pride in that I got to see Reggie Jackson hit his only Caribbean Series homer. Next one, please. Okay, the kid, Gary Carter. Gary Carter was only 19 when he helped Caguas under Bobby Wine win the regular season in Puerto Rico, and he became Mr. Bobby Wine liked him so much that Carter was named to the All-Star team in the '74 Caribbean Series, which defeated Tommy Lasorda's defending champion. So basically, Lasorda, as a manager, won in '73, but then his team was defeated by the Caguas team in 1974, a team that had a third baseman named Mike Schmidt, by the way. Next one, please. These are three players that played for the Caguas team in February of '79 at Santurce's Iram Bithorn Stadium. And Tony Perez played first one left to right. Tony Perez was a longtime Santurce player, but the Caguas team got him to reinforce them at DH. Hector Cruz Hector Cruz actually played a lot better in the Caribbean Series than his brother Jose Cruz, even though Jose had a much better big league career. And on your right, the player manager for Caguas that year was a pretty good second baseman named Felix Millan toward the end of his career. Caguas fired a manager named Jimmy Davenport earlier that season, and then they gave Millan the managing job. Next one, please. This is the ring. The 1979 Magallanes Navigators from Venezuela won the Caribbean Series in '79. Their player manager was a former Detroit Tiger player named Willie Horton, who was like in his mid-30s and still sticking around as a DH, I think, with the Seattle Mariners at the time. But another player manager with a Caribbean Series title, Willie Horton. Next one, please. On your left, you have the famous Mario Mendoza. You know, they joke about the Mendoza line. I guess you have to hit below 215. And Mendoza is a great guy, had a decent managing career in the Angel system when I interviewed him in 1994 in Jackson, Mississippi. Luis Mayoral provided the photo. He was a public relations officer later with the Texas Rangers and the Detroit Tigers. And next one, please. Okay, the great Cal Ripken Jr. Cal played 2 seasons in Puerto Rico, and luckily, thanks to a public relations officer named Bob Miller with Baltimore in '92, '93, I was able to interview Cal in St. Petersburg, Florida, during a spring training prior to a spring training game. Cal was very nice to me. I only had 10 minutes with him, but he talked about that as a 20 and a 21-year-old player playing with 7 or 8 big leaguers on that Caguas team, managed by Ray Miller. Cal told me that Puerto Rico helped him get to the big leagues sooner than he might have otherwise, and just was a great launching pad for him. Unfortunately for Cal, Cal could not play in the 1981 Caribbean Series because Venezuela had an unfortunate player strike. Had that player strike been settled like in late January of 1981, Ray Miller probably takes Mike Boddicker, who was a pretty good pitcher also that winter, and Cal over to. So I really would have, hypothetically, I would have loved to have shared some of Cal's Caribbean stats with you, but unfortunately, I cannot. So next one, please. Okay, so Ray Miller, who was a great guy, Ray Miller is from Ohio originally. He's passed away a number of years ago. Ray Miller is a very cerebral kind of pitching coach, but I believe he also managed Baltimore and Minnesota, and as a great baseball guy. And he managed Cal a couple of years. This is the '80-'81 season where the photo was taken against the Mayagüez Indios, and of course Roberto Mercado, the kid there, the bat boy, is now, of course, in his 50s. So it makes me and other people feel pretty old now. But anyway, Hector Cruz eventually was voted into the Caribbean Series Hall of Fame. Of interest to especially fans of the American League is that Rickey Henderson stole 44 bases the same year that Cal Ripken went to Caguas. And Rickey told me, ironically, in Baltimore, Maryland, in Camden Yards, Rickey agreed to an interview with me, and Rickey told me that the Puerto Rico Winter League in the early 80s was almost big league caliber, and it helped him tremendously. And by the way, Rickey Henderson represented Mexico in the February 1979 Caribbean Series and was named left fielder on the All-Star team. So what's great about winter ball back then in the 70s and 80s, that the major league teams sent their very best prospects to Puerto Rico and the Dominican. And unfortunately, that's no longer the case with the Arizona Fall League and the high dollar contracts, etc. Next one, please. This is Candy Maldonado, very fine outfielder for the Dodgers, Giants. He won a ring with the 92 Blue Jays. Candy is also in the Caribbean Series Hall of Fame, having won it twice for Arecibo in 83 and Caguas in 87. A funny story about the 87 Caribbean Series was that Tim Foley, who later became a coach with the Milwaukee Brewers, who I interviewed in Baltimore, Foley was actually the first Caribbean Series manager who was actually fired halfway through a Caribbean Series, and he got into a fight with a general manager named Felix Millan. So Millan and Foley sort of disliked each other. They had a fight the morning after Puerto Rico lost a 14-13 game to the Dominican, where Puerto Rico had 8 homers but committed 8 errors, and Millan was very dissatisfied. So they had it out, and then Ramon Aviles, who was a coach, was promoted to manager, and that 87 Caguas team won the Caribbean Series for the very first time under an interim manager. It has never happened before or since. Next slide, please. This is Luis Mayoral again on your left with a very talented Dodger and Pirate and Giants player named Manny Mota. Manny Mota is also in the Caribbean Series Hall of Fame with, I think, an astronomical 362 batting average. Mota was the player manager for the 70-71 Licey Tigers when they upset Frank Robinson's 1971 Crabbers, a team, of course, with Donnie Baylor, Tony Perez, and Reggie Jackson. And and of course, as a teenager, I was startled when a Licey team basically came to Puerto Rico with a AAA team and won it for that country for the first time. Next slide, please. This is the Fernando Valenzuela, I believe, did finish his fine big league career with the Orioles. I interviewed Fernando in Baltimore in the summer of 1993, not just a few months after another fine outing for Mexico in the 93 Caribbean Series. In 25 plus Caribbean Series innings, he was 1-0 with a very low, I think he had a 1.05 ERA. And he also benefited from ball tremendously. He said he loved pitching for the local fans, and the excitement in winter ball meant a lot to him coming from a small town in Mexico. Next slide, please. Okay. Next. Oh, there you go. Yep. Dennis Martinez. Oh, yeah, got Dennis there. The next one is Dennis Martinez, I believe. Got him. There you go. Dennis Martinez, as a member of the Expos, pitched. I believe he pitched a perfect game against the. Was it against the Dodgers? And in the early 90s. And Dennis Martinez also pitched for Ray Miller in Puerto Rico and other managers. He pitched in 2 Caribbean Series, 77 and 79. Very, very nice gentleman. He's from the country of Nicaragua, and Roberto Clemente was one of his early heroes. Next slide, please. Okay, so the Caribbean Series was played in Florida in 1990 and 91. Phil Reagan managed the Orioles later in the mid-90s, but Reagan won a Caribbean Series, I believe, in 1988. And he for the Dominican, but Reagan also managed in Venezuela. John Roseboro, by the way, the famous Dodger catcher, was a winning manager in one of these events. Next slide, please. And of course, in 92-93, Mike West, the current Caribbean Series team, they won it in a tiebreaker 92. under a manager named Pat Kelly, who's not the outfielder Pat Kelly, but the manager he's 69 years old now, and he's won over 2,000 minor league baseball games. Mako Oliveras was the winning manager in the 93 event, and Mako won 26 Caribbean Series games as a manager, which is the all-time record. He managed Puerto Rico in 8 of these classics. Next one, please. Okay, this is the last slide for part 1. This is, of course, Pudge Rodriguez on your right, or depending on where you are, and Juan Gonzalez. They were teammates for the same Caguas team that had Cal Ripken more than a decade earlier. Caguas, for several years, had to leave the league for financial reasons, but the franchise came back in the mid-90s, and these two young superstars play for them. So I'm going to let Bob transition to part 2 while I take a quick breather. And I certainly thank you for your time and your attention. Part 2, of course, will pick up with the 1995 Caribbean Series.
Yep. Let me bring up the second PowerPoint here. Just give me a second.
Yes, and by the way, I may have to go through some of the slides quickly because I know it's 7:34 in Baltimore, and I do want to allow a few minutes for questions. Okay, part 2 we pick up in 95. So next slide, please. So in the last 3 decades, of course, the Dominican Republic has won, of course, 10 plus. The Dominican Republic has won 12 of these in the last 30 years. Mexico has won 8, and Puerto Rico has only won 4. Puerto Rico has taken a little bit of they're not as tough as they used to be, I guess. And right now in the current Caribbean Series, we have 5 teams. One of the strangest things, if you recall, is that Japan entered the 2025 Caribbean Series. I don't know if I should say this, but I believe one of the reasons was financial considerations. The entry fee is pretty high right now, and somehow they were able. I guess Japan paid the entry fee, and personally, I would prefer that the Caribbean Series be limited to teams from the Caribbean. But that's all I'll say about that. But next slide, please. Right, this is the famous Dream Team from Puerto Rico. If you all remember, 30 years ago, we had a pretty extensive Major League Baseball player strike that lasted from August 11th of 94 into April of 95. So at that time, a lot of the talented native big leaguers opted to play winter ball. So this Puerto Rico team went 6-0. They defeated Art Howe's team from the Dominican, a team that had Pedro Martinez and many other, Jose Rijo. So this Puerto Rico team had Hall of Famers Roberto Alomar, who had some good years with Baltimore, as well as Edgar Martinez, who was a Hall of Famer mainly as a DH, and Bernie Williams, etc. Next slide, please. This is my first book. This book was published nearly 3 decades ago. It came out in hardcover, but this is a softbound version where they put Roy Campanella. Roy Campanella was one of the 21 Cooperstown inductees who played for Santurce. He also played for Caguas and San Juan. So this was published by McFarlane, and took me about 4 years to do the research. Next slide, please. This is Tony Batista, who had an all-star year, I believe, with Baltimore. Correct me if I'm wrong, in the early 2000s, 2002. Tony played for the Águilas Cibaeñas, which is one of the more prominent Dominican Winter League teams. Tony is also in the Caribbean Series Hall of Fame, and he played on 5 Caribbean Series teams that won the Caribbean World Series. A great third baseman who knocked in 44 runs in 42 Caribbean Series games, which is extremely impressive, isn't it? Next slide, please. This is a famous trifecta leading Santurce, the famous team that had Frank Robinson and Earl Weaver decades earlier. Left to right, you have Ken Griffey Sr., the manager, until the very end when he resigned. There was a little bit of a dispute with him and the ownership. And Grant Jackson, who pitched in relief for many teams, including the Orioles and Yankees and Pirates. And then you have Mako Oliveras, who's on your right, I guess. Mako took over. He was the bench coach, but when Griffey Sr. left Puerto Rico in December of 1999, Mako took over and led Santurce to the finals and to the Caribbean Series. Next slide, please. This is Armando Rios, who was had about a 6-year big league career from the late 90s into the early 2000s. He had some tremendous Caribbean Series stats. When he was a collegiate player in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, under Skip Burtman, his 1991 and 93 LSU Tigers won the NCAA title. So he was an example. But by this time, you're beginning to see a few more Puerto Rican players, go through the college ranks. That was not the case when players like Cepeda and Clemente, came on board. Next slide, please. The Santurce team in 2000 that was managed by Mako Olivares. If you can read that slash line, they had a 368 team batting average, 427 on base, 573 on I'm sorry, 573 slugging. So their OPS was an even 1,000, which is pretty good, isn't it? They scored 58 runs in 6 games, and they were as good as that dream team in '95, except that the players weren't as famous, of course. Tony Pena, the great catcher from the Dominican Republic, managed in that series, and Pena later would win a Caribbean Series as a manager. I also mentioned in this slide the 2020 Caribbean Series, which I witnessed in person, won by the team that Art Howard managed a generation earlier. Lino Rivera was a longtime minor league player, pitcher, who managed that team. And that Caribbean Series included Osni Guillen at the bottom. Osni Guillen is one of the 3 sons of Ozzie Guillen. And the country of Colombia was able to play in the very first Caribbean Series back in 2020. And by the way, I interviewed the GM, the general manager for that Colombia Winter League team back in 2020, was actually a lady, the first female GM in Caribbean Series history. So that was kind of historic, to interview a lady who was actually a general manager. Very, very, very nice person. Next slide, please. My second book was titled The Santurce Crabbers, basically a 6-decade team history. And again, the cover of the book, you have the Murderers Row from 54, 55. And of course, mention of a picture of Earl Weaver. Earl's nickname in Puerto Rico, the fans used to call him Mickey Rooney when he went out to argue, because the people in Puerto Rico that used to see Mickey Rooney in movies thought that Earl reminded them of Mickey Rooney. He was kind of feisty and very colorful and won a title in Puerto Rico. Next slide, please. These are 5 Venezuelan players. The tallest player of the quintet is a guy named Miguel Cabrera, who's on I guess for me he's on the far right. Miguel Cabrera was like 20 years old then, and he had just come off his rookie year with a actually he played for the Marlins in 2003, called up in June, I think, and under Jack McKeon helped the Marlins defeat the Yankees in the Fall Classic. So he goes from the Fall Classic to Winter Ball. Of course, nowadays that would be unheard of. They wouldn't allow that to happen. Maglio Ordonez is number 33, if you can see him in your slide. But that team was not good enough to win the Caribbean Series, but they competed. Next slide, please. This is Mako Olivares, who was managing the Montgomery Biscuits in the Southern League AA. I was, of course, working in Jackson, Mississippi at the time, and these were the Mississippi Braves playing a AA game against the Montgomery Biscuits. And of course, and Mako and I have become friends, for the past 2 decades. Next slide, please. Felix Fermin managed the AC Águilas Ibaeñas. He managed them 5 different Caribbean Series. He has the best managing record in this Winter Classic, 25-7. He's the only manager in Caribbean Series history to win 4 as a manager. So I guess he deserved a lot of recognition. Next slide, please. This is the Atomic Ant. Louis Polonia played in 14 Winter Caribbean Series. He still holds the record with 94 Caribbean Series hits, had a lifetime 301 batting average. So very colorful player, very usually hit leadoff, was a DH and a left fielder primarily in these events. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the stadium. This is the Águilas Stadium. It seats about 18,000 fans. If you want to compare that to the current Mexicali, Mexico Stadium tonight, Mexicali seats about 17,000. So that's kind of typical for a Caribbean Series host. It varies, of course, by venue, but this is one of the nicer stadiums in the Dominican Republic, in the town of Santiago. Next one, please. Okay, you have Tony Pena and Miguel Delaunay, who both for many years played for the Aguilas franchise, and they're Pena is from a small town and not too far from where Juan Marichal was born and raised. So there's a lot of history in that part of the country, in the rural area. Delaunay was a good outfielder in the big leagues. Next one, please. Pat Kelly, who I mentioned earlier, unofficially got his 2000th minor league win in his 35th season as a skipper for the Louisville Bats. And had it not been for COVID back in 2020, I believe Kelly would have, a few more minor league wins. Kelly, of course, managed in two different Caribbean series. He was 5-2 for Mayaguez in '92, and then he managed Arecibo in '96 to a 4-2 record. That Arecibo team did not win it, but they had players like Bernie Williams and Pudge Rodriguez, and so it was a pretty good team that he managed. Next slide, please. In 2020, Osney, who I mentioned earlier, managed the Columbia team. He's the taller of the two. His father, Ozzie Guillen, believe it or not, last winter, a year ago, Ozzie Guillen became the second manager in Caribbean Series history to win a Caribbean Series as a manager after winning a World Series. Tommy Lasorda won two World Series with the Dodgers, '81 and '88. Ozzie, of course, won a World Series with the 2005 Chicago White Sox prior to managing La Guaira to the title last year. Next slide, please. This is yours truly, Tom, with Mexico's Elvis. Of course, I guess Elvis is still alive and popular all over the world, including Mexico. And so we took that picture in between games 5 years ago. So that was kind of fun for me because I'm a big Elvis fan, of course. Having followed Elvis since his concert in Hawaii in the late '60s. Next slide, please. This is Luis Sojo, who had a great, primarily American League career with the Mariners and Yankees. Sojo is also in the Caribbean Series Hall of Fame as of 5 years ago. He allowed me to take a picture of him. Sojo basically did tell me that he was a little bit disillusioned with the commissioner of baseball, Mr. Manfred, and the MLB Players Union, primarily because they make it somewhat difficult to allow big league players to play in the Winter Classic. To give you an example, he was very disappointed when Jose Altuve and Elvis Andrus, a great double play combination, were not allowed to play in the 2013 Caribbean Series. He was extremely disappointed with that, but that's the way it is. Big league teams still exert a lot of power over the winter league teams. Next one, please. These are the Dominican fans 5 years ago celebrating in Bithorn Stadium in Puerto Rico, which I covered. I took that photo, and there are a lot of Dominicans who actually live in Puerto Rico, and basically Puerto Rico obviously had the home field advantage when they defeated the Lara Cardinals. And coincidentally, the Lara Cardinals, as we speak, are playing the Escogido Lions from the Dominican Republic. So 5 years ago, Lara won the Venezuelan title, and this winter season, Lara came back to win it again. Next slide, please. Oh, before I forget, can I say something very interesting? Earl Weaver, back in around '63, '64, Earl Weaver actually managed the Lara Cardinals in Venezuela Winter League. A lot of people don't know this, but Weaver managed Santurce for 2 seasons from '66 to '68, and he also managed the Lara Cardinals in the Venezuelan Winter League. And I personally believe Weaver corresponded with me twice via mail. I never met him, but Earl did tell me a couple times that winter ball was very important to him. He also played winter ball as a second baseman in the Dominican Republic for the Águilas Ibaeñas, who I mentioned earlier. This slide shows Phil Reagan accepting a plaque. Phil Reagan is extremely popular in the Dominican, and having managed them to a title. And Big Papi Ortiz was also inducted into the Caribbean Series Hall of Fame, in addition to Cooperstown. And I did correspond with Reagan once by mail, and he told me that winter ball was very, very good to him, starting from the early 1960s when Phil pitched winter ball in Puerto Rico for Mayaguez. So winter ball has played a very important role in the career of many players, both stateside and Caribbean players. Next one, please. This is a beautiful stadium used a couple of years ago in Venezuela. This one has a capacity for 14,300. However, the biggest stadium, well, a really big stadium that Venezuela has, seats 38,000, which is very similar to Lone Depot Park, which hosted last year's Caribbean Series. And Venezuela has a lot of political and other issues, but they somehow they come through with the money when it comes to renovating baseball stadiums. Next one, please. Luis Soho, who I showed earlier, Luis Soho was the general manager of last year's Caribbean Series champions, and he engineered a very important trade. As I said a few minutes ago, winter ball is really more about winning than developing players. So Soho made a major 8-player trade where he got 4 guys from the Aragua team, and one of them was a pitcher on the top here on your screen. Angel Padron pitched a no-hitter last year against Nicaragua, so a lefty. Now, the great catcher, Wilson Contreras, even though Soho wanted him, Wilson Contreras and his agent apparently decided that he would not play winter ball last year, which is unfortunate because I guess maybe they're afraid of getting hurt or whatever. But that's just the reality in today's winter league world. Next one, please. This is, of course, Lone Depot Park, capacity 37,446. Hosted a successful event last year. Next one, please. The Miguel Cabrera is a huge fan. I mean, a lot of Venezuelan fans love Miguel Cabrera, who's probably going to make it on his first entry into the Hall of Fame, his first vote. Venezuela actually, under Ozzie Guillen's leadership, only lost 1 game last year. They were 7-1. Their only loss came to the Caguas team, 6-2. And luckily I attended that game, and the enthusiasm was just incredible. Full house. Next one, please. The Rawlings company basically produces the baseballs that are used in the Caribbean Series, so it's a legitimate baseball. Obviously, I don't think it's doctored in any way, shape, or form. It has the name of the commissioner of the Caribbean Confederation, Juan Pello Herrera, is on it. Next slide, please. This was the Mouse that Roared. This is a team that had players, some big leaguers, by the way. Profar was on that team. Shoup was on that team. The shortstop, I can't, his name slips me for a second, but Curacao upset Caguas 2-0 to make it to the semifinals. They ended up with the same record, but because of the window, head-to-head competition, Curacao got the nod and made it to the semifinals. Next one, please. I think we're coming to the end of the presentation. This is the mascot, kind of a quiet mascot. Mascot was getting ready for the final game, and this was a subdued moment, kind of getting ready for the big one between Venezuela and the Dominican. Next one. Next slide. This just gives you a quick synopsis. The Dominican has won 203 games, Puerto Rico 204, but of course the Dominican 22 titles, Puerto Rico 16, Mexico 9, Venezuela 8, Cuba 8, Panama 2, and Colombia 1. Next slide, please. And we're coming. This is the book, my current book that was published, just came out like at the end of January last week. It's available. I guess the next slide. On this slide, Willie Mays, by the way, is scoring. Willie Mays just hit a walk-off homer February 13th, 1955. So the excited teammates are waiting for Mays to jump on home plate. That home run basically defeated Magallanes and allowed Santurce to win the Caribbean Series with a great outfield. By the way, Clemente had to play left field at the time because Bob Thurman, the right fielder who was 36 years old, Thurman actually had a better arm than Clemente at the time, if you can believe that. Next slide, please. These are some of your, if you're interested, I believe that Barnes & Noble and Amazon and publisher McFarland, if anybody's interested in the ebook version, which Amazon, I guess, calls the Kindle version, people can order the ebook version as well as the softbound, which is more expensive. And of course, Books A Million and Target also, have the softbound one available if people wish to use those venues. Next one, please. And I think finally, okay, this is my favorite one, really, because I told Bob earlier that I wanted to end this presentation with the Babe Ruth slide. A couple of years ago, actually, on February 6th of 2023, I was actually in Hot Springs, Arkansas, in an RV park, and I was able to attend a very important ceremony at Majestic Park where we honored the great Babe Ruth. And I think there are a handful of these statues available worldwide, but this is the one in Hot Springs, Arkansas. And Babe is still very popular believe it or not, in Hot Springs. People still talk about his home runs as a member of the Red Sox and as a member of the Yankees. Next one, please. And finally, the Babe Ruth World Series actually takes place later this summer at Majestic Park. So if any of you are traveling in the Southwest or wherever you might be, if you're in Texas for the SABR conference in June, maybe you can stick around and maybe make it to Hot Springs, Arkansas for the Babe Ruth World Series. And I believe my last slide mentions Janet Murray Smith, who was originally from, she's a very well-known architect from Jackson, Mississippi. And she, as I mentioned, has modeled a number of famous ballparks, including the prominent Camden Yards. I think we have to make it as quickly as possible. So maybe Bob can coordinate, any questions you might have or comments you might have. Yeah.
First of all, thank you for you timed it perfectly. We got about 7 minutes left for any questions that people might have. If anybody wants to either raise their hand, I think there's a hand raising button on here, or type it in the chat. Either way, excellent presentation. I really enjoyed it. Questions, comments, thoughts?
Yeah.
Anybody?
Oh, the chat. Oh, I see the chat. I see that Jeff mentioned that Brooks Robinson began as a second baseman in York, Pennsylvania. So that makes sense. So basically, he did play a fair amount of second base as a youngster.
Yep.
Interesting. Before he played in Cuba. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, if there aren't any more questions, I'm going to make a quick plug for the BBRC annual meeting on February 17th, which sounds weird to have it on a Monday, but it happens to be President's Day. We're having it at the Peabody Brewery in Baltimore, and if you've seen the list of speakers lined up, it'll be a really fun day of baseball in mid-February, just when we need it the most. I'm the one that's taking the reservation names, and many of you have paid for it, and we also take money at the door. But I do see several planned attendees online here tonight, so appreciate that and spread the word. It should be a great day of baseball in at the Peabody.
Oh, by the way, could I have a couple minutes just to have some wrap up comments from my end here?
Of course.
Okay, so right now the quick update: Dominican Republic 3, Venezuela 3. We're in the top of the ninth inning. So basically, the winner of that game tonight will play Friday night against the winner of the Mexico Puerto Rico game later tonight. So that's a very exciting game tonight, 3-3. The 2026 Caribbean Series, next year's Caribbean Series, will be hosted by San Juan, Puerto Rico, and so that's kind of interesting. And there were just a couple quick things about the Caribbean Series trivia that Dave Parker, correct me if I'm wrong, but Dave Parker will be inducted in Cooperstown this summer via the Veterans Committee, and he'll be the 33rd big leaguer that that involved in the Caribbean Series that was inducted in Cooperstown. So basically, before Dave Parker was inducted, you had 32 members of Cooperstown who were involved in some way in the Caribbean or Inter-American Series, which is pretty significant, including Marichal, Cepeda, Clemente, and so on, Frank Robinson.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, I thought I'd mention that. Well,
yep.
Thank you for your time. I get a little pumped up talking about winter ball because I was a kid when we got off that ship from Baltimore. I guess that changed my life, because what if I had stayed in Maryland? Maybe I'd be a member of your chapter and I'd be talking about the 1983 Baltimore Orioles and Joe Altobelli, but I guess it didn't happen that way.
You can still join. You don't have to.
Right. That's right. There's no limit to how many chapters. I don't believe there's a limit to how many chapters you can join, and if nothing else, you get notifications of these types of Zooms. So anyway, well, thank you everybody for joining. I appreciate your time, and have a great rest of the week, and hopefully we'll see some of you in Baltimore on the 17th. Thank you very much. Take care.
Okay.
Bye-bye.